Wednesday afternoon with a couple concerning another hall, and we may be coming up with another hall. It would be for October, beginning in October. I don't know exactly when in October, and it would be the answer to our problems if it works out. I'll have to wait and see. It's about the most promising one that I've had so far, and it seems to me like I've been in so many halls and buildings and schools and talked to so many people here in Clackamas County that surely one of these is going to work out for us. And I rather hope this one will work out for us. It would be a nice accommodation, and certainly it would be big enough. It would seat somewhere over 400. So that would give us room for some expansion, which we need desperately. We need the expansion as well as the room. So do be praying about it. Well, we over the last few years here in the South Church have been continually concentrating, I think, upon one thing more than anything else, is the fact that we're supposed to be developing the mind and the character of Christ. We've used Philippians 2:5 till I think all of you just know where it is, and you could automatically turn to it and already know what it says. So I'm not going to quote that scripture, but we have concentrated on that. And today I want to talk about something that has always been kind of a marvel to me, something that I've admired in the character of Christ, something that I wish that I had in the way that Christ had it, and I wish all of you brethren had. It's found in Hebrews, the 13th chapter and the 8th verse. Hebrews, the 13th chapter and the 8th verse. It's a characteristic that, again, as I say, is one that I feel that all of us need, and I certainly, in my own mind, I've marveled at it through the years as I've run across this scripture in my study and in using it in sermons. Hebrews 13, verse 8 says, Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. Don't you wish that you had that characteristic in your life? Jesus Christ was dependable, he was predictable, he was stable physically and emotionally, under stress, good times and bad times. Jesus Christ was capable of handling any and every situation that he was ever faced with. And he handled it the same before he was born as a physical human being. When he was with God the Father, their creation, he was that way. Born as a physical human being and took on human flesh, he was the same way. He was always able to handle the circumstances around him, and he is going to be that way forever. Don't you wish that you could handle your human life instead of letting your human life handle you? Too many times in our lives, we let circumstances around us be our motivating factor, be our attitude, and be our mood, or however we feel, or however we live on any given day or week or month or year. We're pushed around by life. It would be kind of nice. It would be kind of nice to be able to handle life and push it around instead of having it push you. Well, Jesus Christ was a type of individual that could handle himself. Now, he had bad times. He had times when he was under stress. He had times when he was in trouble. He had times when he had difficulties, but he was always able to handle it. He was always able to deal with it instead of letting it handle him. And as I say, I've marveled at this because I don't know of any human being other than Christ that's been able to do that. That's been able to handle life instead of having life handle him or her. I want to give you a few examples, about 5 of them today. Examples of how Christ handled himself. Now, these are going to be things that you and I wrestle with, that you and I have difficulties with occasionally, sometimes regularly, and sometimes we don't handle them well at all. First one is found in Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 2. Then I want to go back and show you how Christ handled them. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 2 and 3. This has to do with one part of our body, the one that gives us the most problems, and that's our mouth. That's the biggest problem that we have in our physical human body. I think that if God at creation had just not created a mouth on human beings, he would have had a lot less problems with them, or at least they would have had a lot less problems with each other if we couldn't talk. It would eliminate the majority of our sins. Because it says here in verse 2, says, "Be not rash with your mouth, and let not your heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and you're upon earth. Therefore let your words be few. For a dream comes through the multitude of business, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words." You know, it's kind of like it says in another proverb. I don't think I have it in my notes here. But you know, even a fool is considered wise as long as he keeps his mouth shut. Is the essence of it. But we have a problem sometimes in the fact that we have diarrhea of the mouth. You know, we're just running off all the time. And we speak too much, talk too much. And so we need to be careful, and it's something that we need to understand, that there is that tendency that a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words, the number of words that he uses. Proverbs 15, there's a multitude of scriptures on this, and I'm not going to dwell on them today. I'm just introducing the subject, basically. Proverbs 15, verse 23, talks about a man's mouth in a positive way. Proverbs 15, verse 23, and this is what we're striving for. Proverbs 15, verse 23, says, "A man has joy by the answer of his mouth, and a word spoken in due season, how good it is." Now there's what we're striving for. There's what we're striving for, to have joy by our mouth and to say the right thing at the right time. That's the thing that we are to be striving for. And it would be nice, wouldn't it? It would be nice to always say the right thing at the right time and to always know what to say and when to say it. Now, there isn't a single solitary one of us that can say we have attained to that. I know that I haven't. I know I have said some things, and I say too many things occasionally, and they just are not things that should be said. I have a problem with it. I have to wrestle with it, because I do too much talking as far as I'm concerned, too. And I'm, well, on Sabbath and sermons, I'm forced to talk continually. But not everything that I say should be said. But I try to do it, but I just don't attain to it. And yet we take a look at Jesus Christ in Matthew the 13th chapter. And again, I'm not going to dwell on these subjects and make them long. I'm just going to bring them to your attention so that we can think about them. Because in Matthew 13, verse 53 and verse 54, Jesus Christ had gone into his own area, his own country. In Matthew 13, verse 53 and verse 54, "It came to pass that when Jesus had finished these parables, he departed," he left. "And when he was come into his own country, he taught them in their synagogue, insomuch that they were astonished, and said, Whence has this man this wisdom and these mighty works?" So here he goes in to talk to his own relatives. I went to, well, probably relatives as well as people in his own area. Went to a church picnic last Sunday afternoon with my relatives, the Wilsons. And they come by the dozens. There's usually 100, 150. I don't think there are quite that many this year. And boy, what do you say to relatives? Because I'm the only preacher in the crowd. And I don't know of any other Wilson that has ever been a minister. Not from my family, anyway. Because they just don't have proclivities that way. And so when they get around me, you can imagine there's certain apprehension, a certain tightness, because my brothers and sisters and my cousins and my nephews and all of them are not the type that go to church every week. 2 nephews that are dealers at the poker tables in Las Vegas. Now that's more or less typical of the Wilson clan. And so when they get around me, why, my tendency is just to shut up, period, and not say anything. Because if I say anything that even remotely relates to religion, if it's, even the closest to religion, why, it's going to be a problem. And so I don't know what to say. I don't have the slightest idea what to say around it. And so it's like my son. He was here last week, and he went to a family picnic, and he took a Louis L'Amour book. And then he didn't talk to anybody. He read his book, and he enjoyed the picnic. But at any rate, I'd like to have the wisdom to say the right thing. I really would, around my relatives, because I might criticize them, but I love my brothers and sisters, and I certainly love my mother and father, and I like the Wilsons. One thing, a gripe I've got against TV, and this is a pet gripe. But any Wilson that you ever see on TV is always the crook. You just take a note and you think about it. He's always the guy that's the bad guy. And I think that's prejudiced. Not racial. Well, maybe it is racial. I don't know. But, I would like to have, though, kidding, I'd like to have the words to say, the right words to say around relatives. I really would. Or around anybody. Sometimes, and I deal with people in situations where husbands have died or wives have died or where this has happened and that's happened. And what do you say? What do you say when you go in the hospital to visit someone who's in a hospital Thursday, Providence Hospital? What do you say to a sick person? It's not easy to always have the right words. And sometimes we say the wrong words. But Jesus Christ didn't say the wrong words. He said the right words. And to me, that's a characteristic I'd like to have. And to be able to do it all the time under every circumstance, to say the right words. Well, that would really be great. Well, Jesus Christ had that characteristic, and really that's what we're striving toward, isn't it? We're striving to build the mind and the character of Jesus Christ. And he always had the right words. And boy, I wish I always had the right words. And in preparing the sermon, I couldn't help but think that I'm going to work on it a little harder. I'm going to work on it a little harder to say the right words at the right time, under the right circumstances. It'll avoid a lot of trouble for myself and for the people around me, and I'll be a little more like Christ, which is exactly what I want. All right, the second one is a proper use of anger. The proper use of anger. Now, some people think that Jesus Christ was a little panty-waist that never would raise his voice, and never would get mad or angry. Well, now, wait a minute. Let's take a look at what the Scripture has to say. Because sometimes people put down their anger so much that they don't have gumption enough to stand up. They couldn't get mad at anything. Well, is that right? Well, then there are other people that fly off the handle at everything. And they got one of these tempers that everybody knows about and everybody clears out when they get mad, which is most of the time. Now, is that right? Now, somewhere along the line, we have to understand. Over in Proverbs 14, verse 17, tells us a little about individuals who have a temper and can't control it. Proverbs 14, verse 17. He that is soon angry deals foolishly. The man of wicked devices is hated. The man who loses his temper is a fool. He deals foolishly. Because when you lose your temper, you end up saying things that you shouldn't say. You don't have any control over your words. You don't have any control over your actions. And you do things and say things that you have to repent on later, that you shouldn't have said or you shouldn't have done. So if you have a quick temper, well, you have a tendency to do dumb, foolish things, and to say dumb, foolish things that get you into trouble. Now, that's a quick-tempered individual. Then Proverbs 29 tells you what the result is of a quick temper. Proverbs 29, verse 22. It says, an angry man stirs up strife, and a furious man abounds in transgressions. You just cause all sorts of trouble by losing your temper. That doesn't get you anything. It just stirs up trouble. Okay? Well, what is the right approach to the thing? How do you handle it? Is it all right to get angry? Is it all right to lose your temper once in a while? Well, the Apostle Paul, over in Ephesians 4 and verse 26, tells us something about being angry. 4 and verse 26. The Apostle Paul says, be angry and sin not. Oh, you mean it's possible? It's possible to get mad. It's possible to get angry. You don't always have to be this composite, docile, innocuous type personality that never has any anger whatsoever, never gets upset, can just handle anything and everything in a docile, quiet mood, and that type of individual. No, it's, according to this, it says it is possible to get angry and to not sin. And it says that we are, when we get to be angry, to sin not. Well, again, I think we have a prime example of Jesus Christ on times that he got angry. He got mad, and he didn't sin. It's found in Matthew 23. This one particular occasion. I can think of another occasion when Christ, ran the animals out of the temple. But I wanted to use this one because he really gets riled up in this one. Christ really gets riled up in this one, and he didn't sin. And this is the proper use of anger. Matthew 23 and verse 13. He was dealing, beginning in verse 13, he was dealing with the scribes and the Pharisees, who were a self-righteous lot, who claimed to be following God and were teaching the traditions of their own mind. And he says unto the scribes and the Pharisees, he says, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! And you suppose he just said, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. No, he didn't. He said, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourselves, neither suffer you them that are entering to go in. Now that's laying it right on the line. You could tell he was riled up about it, and he meant what he was saying, and he wasn't mincing words with him. He says, woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore you're going to receive the greater damnation. In other words, you're headed straight for hellfire. Woe unto you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you compass the sea on land to make one proselyte, and when he's made, you make him twofold more the children of hell or the grave than yourselves. And then in verse 33 he says, you serpents, you snakes, you generation of vipers, how can you escape the damnation of hell? Now that's not exactly what you call a placid individual that's saying that. He was mad. He was angry about it. He was upset at them, and he told them so. But Jesus Christ never sinned. He never sinned. It's all right to get angry and to get upset in a right way about the right thing. It's all right to get angry and get upset at something that is wrong, something that is a sin. There's nothing wrong with getting angry or upset about it, as long as you're right, as long as it is wrong. And there's nothing wrong with telling people when they are wrong, if it's a proper time and under the proper circumstances. There's nothing wrong with telling them in no uncertain terms when they're wrong, and getting upset and doing it. There's nothing wrong with that. But too many times our anger is just out of frustration, and it's wild, uncontrolled anger at a situation, and not at something that is literally wrong, and we lose all control, and we don't have control over our words. Christ was controlled the words that he said. He knew what he was saying. He understood what he was saying. And he wasn't just sounding off, as we do sometimes when we're angry, as all of us do when we lose our temper. So again, as I say, I wish that I could always be angry in a right way. I don't want to always be angry. That type of person I don't think want to always be mad. But when I do get mad, I want to learn to control it in the right way and sin not. But again, that's a characteristic that Christ had. He could get angry and not sin. Now that, to me, is a tremendous characteristic, and one that we could all strive for and learn to use in our lives. All right, the third one is to be strong and to stand fast. Some days we're weak, some days we're strong. Some days we're up, some days we're down, some weeks we're down, some months we're down. And then occasionally we'll have an hour or two that we're up, Well, Christ wasn't that way. He was strong, and he always stood fast. Now, there are many, many examples of this in a positive way throughout the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And I want to give you just a couple of three scriptures to think about. First one's found in Daniel 11. This one is a short 3 or 4 verses, or 5 verses, of what the end-time church is going to be like. Or no, not just the end-time church. The entire church of God is going to be like through history. And it just gives you the characteristic of the church. Daniel 11, beginning in verse 32. It says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Wouldn't it be nice to always be strong and always be busy doing the thing that you should be doing in relationship to your part in getting God's work done? It would be nice to be that way all the time. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and spoil many days. In other words, it shows you're going to go through all sorts of horrible trials, all sorts of horrible difficulties, and it's going to be tough, but in that, they're still going to be strong. They're still going to stand strong, and they're going to do exploits, and they're going to go about their job and their responsibility of instructing the people that God calls. In other words, they're able to stand up strong for God and for God's church continually. They never have any weak moments. Again, as I say, that's another one of those characteristics that I think we all need and should want. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 10 says the same thing. The Apostle Paul talking to Timothy. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13, Apostle Paul talking to the church at Corinth. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. He says, watch you. Stand fast in the faith. Be nice with it. If we could always stand fast and always be watching. He says, quit you like men. He says, are we going to be like human beings who get about halfway through a job and quit? No, he doesn't want us to be that way. Be strong, he says. We're not supposed to quit about halfway. Proverbs talks about the individual that quits about halfway down the line. Maybe starts out strong and ends up weak. Proverbs, the 24th chapter, and the 10th verse. Proverbs 24 and verse 10. Proverbs 24 and verse 10. He says, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. In other words, if you don't have the guts and the backbone and the strength to stand up in the time of trouble, you don't have much strength. Anybody can stand when things are going easy and good and going, no problems and no difficulties. Your real strength is proven when you run into trouble. And that's the thing we have to do, brethren, is to build that strength so that in time of trouble, we're going to stand tall instead of failing. That's a characteristic as Christ had, as I'll show you in just a few minutes. Down in verse 16 of this same chapter, he says, for a just man falls 7 times and rises up again, but the wicked shall fall into mischief. In other words, a just man may run into difficulty and may slip a little bit, but he picks himself up and goes ahead. And that's to be the type of character and personality that we have. We may have difficulties, but always pick up and go ahead. Our biggest trial is when we have to face Satan the devil. It's found in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, and there really is a devil. I once had a counseling years ago, and a man tried to convince me that there was no devil. And I guess there is a church that believes that. But that's not true. There is a devil, there is a Satan, and in Ephesians, the 6th chapter, the Bible tells us that we need strength to face him directly from God, and we need that help. Ephesians, the 6th chapter, verses 10 and 11. He says, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. It takes strength to stand against Satan. Sometimes I think that we don't realize that Satan is the god of this world. And you face a problem in the world, and maybe it's in school, or maybe it's on your job, or maybe it's wherever it is that you face a problem or a difficulty in your daily life in this world. You don't realize that the real, true source of that is Satan, because he is the god of this world. And he's the one that is motivating and guiding and directing the attitudes and the character and the personality and the ways of this world around us that we have to fight continually. And he's part of our battle. And we have to have, as it goes on to say here, the whole armor of God in order to fight against that. We have to have special help from God. Well, Satan is also the enemy of Jesus Christ. And we turn to Luke, the 2nd chapter, and the 40th verse. We begin to find out a little bit about Jesus Christ. Luke, the 2nd chapter, and the 40th verse, talking about Christ as a child. This would have been around when he was around 12 years old. Luke 12 and verse 40. It says, and the child grew, referring to Christ, and waxed strong in spirit, filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And this was around 12 years old. And he waxed strong in the Spirit. He had God's Spirit and he used it at 12 years old. And he was filled with the wisdom of God. Well, he was going to need that because when he was 27 years old, we find him in Matthew the 4th chapter facing Satan the devil, the enemy that we need strength to face. And you see what he was able to do. Now, this was when he was 27. He was 15 years later. But in Matthew, the 4th chapter, beginning in verse 8. Now, the story begins at the first of this chapter, but we'll pick it up in verse 8. Because here he meets Satan face to face. Now, you and I don't meet him face to face. Satan works against us in subtleties. He works against us through human instruments, just as Mr. Oliver was saying that God does. It's amazing how the comparison sometimes, you see that God works through human instruments. And then if you really study the Bible, you understand that Satan also does the same thing. He also works through human instruments. And many of the things and the ways that God works, Satan counterfeits. Satan counterfeits and tries to use the same system, only for an ulterior purpose and for another purpose. And so Satan, just like God, works through human instruments. You can find that in 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter. He works through human instruments. And so you and I don't face Satan directly. We just face, his human instruments and the society that he's built and the world that he's built around. And so we're not forced to face him directly. But here we have a case where Christ was forced to face him directly. An individual that was capable of motivating and directing and guiding an earth, the human beings on it, through his subtleties and through his lies and through his deceit. But here we have Christ dealing with him directly. I don't think I would like to deal with Satan directly. I know as a minister, occasionally, I'm called upon to deal with demons. And that is one of the worst things that I can think of in working with insofar as a minister is concerned. If I get involved and I know I'm being involved with demons, and especially if the individual is not doing anything about it, I usually find the quickest exit, the most convenient and the easiest way of getting out of a very difficult situation. I like to disappear off the scene because I don't like dealing with them. I can still remember one occasion out east of Vancouver, British Columbia. I should have known it when I walked up to the door. I walked into a house and had some loud speaking, and I don't even know what it was, but it was a house that was filthy and dirty, and it was a house that just reeked of demons. You just knew they were there. And by the time I got out of the house, and I wasn't there more than 3 or 4 minutes, I had to go home and take a shower. I really did. Put my clothes in the dirty clothes, send my suit to the cleaners, because there's just something about it that I can't stand. I don't know about you, but I don't like being around them. I never, as far as I know, have ever faced Satan the devil. I remember once early in my ministry, too. This was before I got out of college. They had a practice in Pasadena in your junior and senior year to take the students out with the ministers on visits to see how you counseled people and dealt with people and to begin to deal with them if they showed potential for being in the ministry. Well, in my senior year, after I'd spent 3 months with Mr. Friddle in Seattle, why, they put me on sermonettes, and I gave sermons even in the Pasadena area, and I was on visiting, and I did visiting on my own, and they assigned to me this man who had a problem with demons. And I had to go down and see him once or twice a week for month after month. I never did get anywhere with him and helping him, but of course there had been several ministers who had been ministers for years who tried and didn't get anywhere. That's why I had the job. And so, it taught me something. I'm not sure what it was. I think basically that I just didn't have control over demons and over the devil, and that you're better off to leave them alone and to not fool around with them unless somebody wanted to straighten out their life. I know how to deal with that aspect of it, but just to deal with them per se, to me, is one of the most horrible jobs that a person can have. As I say, I don't think I've ever dealt with Satan directly. I know I haven't, because I'd be no match there. But here we see Christ dealing directly with Satan, the devil himself. And he was able to handle the situation. He says again, the devil takes him up into an exceeding high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them. Satan the devil took him up and showed him the whole world, which he was ruling. And he said unto him, all these things will I give you if you will fall down and worship me. Satan promised him the whole world. Think of that. It'd be a politician's dream, wouldn't it? The whole world. And here the God of the world was promising it and probably would have delivered. Probably would have given it to him. And you look at it and he looked down at it and, you mean it's all mine? He probably knows a little more than we do, though. Who'd want it under those circumstances? That's just a world full of problems. And politicians, if they really understood, they wouldn't want their jobs either. But at any rate, what did Christ say? Then said Jesus to him, get out of here, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, the angels came and ministered to him. In other words, he put Satan in his place, told him to leave, and he left. I would like to be able to do that. I'd like to be able to control and to stand fast for God all the time against all opposition, even the strongest opposition, to where nothing deterred me. And here is the strongest opposition you could possibly run up against to have to stand fast on, to stand strong on. And that's against Satan himself. And Christ demonstrated that he could stand and stand fast for God and God's way of life against the strongest opposition that you could find, Satan the devil. Wouldn't it be nice to have that strength? To have that strength to stand strong and to stand fast under any and all circumstances. Incredible when you stop and think about it. A characteristic of Jesus Christ. And to do it every time. And for all time. And to never weaken. That's why I say I think it's a tremendous scripture back in Hebrews 13 verse 8. Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. In other words, he's not weakening on the subject or on the point. He didn't have his weak moments. He could have done that any time of day or night. Before he was Christ, during the time that he was Christ here on earth as a physical human being, and today, he could still handle the situation. Able to handle it and stand strong and stand fast. That's a characteristic that I think almost anybody would want, as far as I'm concerned. All right, the fourth one. Christ never did anything to please himself. None of the things that he did were motivated from a selfish motive. Everything he did was for the good of others. Now there's one for you. Think about it for your marriage. Think about it for your relationship among you kids. Think about it in your relationship on your job. Think about it in your relationship with your neighbors. Think about it in relationship with your relatives. Just think, if everything you did was not for your own good, but it was for the good of others. Tremendous characteristic. Romans, the 15th chapter. One that really takes a lot of thinking. One you could probably give 2 or 3 sermons on. Romans 15, though, summarizes it beautifully. Romans 15, beginning in verse 1. It says, we then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak, and not to please ourselves. What an amazing thing to say. We ought to bear the infirmities of other people, and not to please ourselves. Not for our own vanity, to puff ourselves up, to make ourselves important. Not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. What a characteristic. To always want to do what is good for the other person. You stop and think about that one. How many of us have that characteristic? Well, I know I don't have it perfectly. And when I just look at it and realize in human relationship what that would do with human relationship. On the marriage level, or on the social level in dealing with relatives, or on the social level dealing with neighbors, or on your job, and so on. If everything you did, every single solitary thing you did, was to please the other person, and that none of the things that you did were selfish or self-centered or done for yourself, what a tremendous characteristic to have. What an amazing characteristic. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproached you fell on me. In other words, everything the world's done wrong, he assumed the guilt for and died for. And he took the responsibility for all the sins of every human being and for every sin that they have ever committed on himself. He says, I'll take the blame for it, Father. Don't blame them, blame me. What an incredible thing, when you stop and think about it. He didn't try to please himself. He just basically and always pleased the other person. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, and we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. And this is right in context with not pleasing ourselves. But how many times in our decisions, in dealing with one another on a personal level, how many times do we make a decision that pleases us and don't take into consideration the other individual? How many times do we come up against something that we want to do, that the other individual doesn't want to do, and we're in a position to make the decision we do what we want to do, irregardless? Amazing. Amazing. How many times do we approach things that way? From a selfish point of view, Jesus Christ never did. Jesus Christ never did. All right, the final characteristic. Not self-willed or self-centered. In other words, not determined it's always going to be your way or else. Not determined it's going to be your way or else. Over in the book of Titus, the first chapter, verse 7, there's some instructions to the ministry. And several ministers in the past history of God's church have gotten themselves in trouble over this. It's one I strive, to the best of my ability, to work on, because it's one that could get me in trouble in my ministry, and I know it all too well. And so I protect against it. I remember this particular scripture, and I'll say this is one that I think I do a reasonable job on in relationship to the church. Now, not in personal life. I don't do all that well at it. But in relationship to the church, I do a reasonable job on it, as some other ministers have gotten themselves into difficulties over it. Titus 1 and verse 7. For a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed. In other words, determining that you're right, and it's going to be your way or else. And if everybody else doesn't bend to your way of doing, why, that's just tough. We've had ministers that have come up with doctrines, they come up with concepts and ideas that they knew they were right. And they expected the whole church to change and everybody to agree with them. Well, now that's not right, frankly. Because when you set yourself up as a minister of one, to establish yourself as an authority in an area, that's not very brilliant. Because you'll soon find out if you take a composite of 500 other ministers and all the knowledge and information they have concerning the Scriptures and all the studying they've done and all the prayers they've prayed and all that they have grown spiritually over however long they've been in the ministry, you'll soon find out there is a remote chance that as a combined body they might know a shade more than you do as an individual, putting it mildly. And so when we set ourselves up as an authority and determined that we are right and we're going to maintain our being right no matter what, and we're self-willed about it, and it's going to be our way or no way, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. As it tells you in the 9th verse here about the ministry. He says, we are to hold fast the faithful word as we have been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convict the gainsayer. Christ was not a self-willed person. Christ was not a self-willed person. Let's take a look at a couple scriptures. Matthew 26. He didn't set himself up as an authority, even though he was an authority, amazingly enough. Matthew, the 26th chapter, in the 39th verse. This is a famous one that we use during the Passover section, Passover time, and yet it tells you something about Christ, that he was flexible in a right way. He was flexible in a right way. He was not a self-willed person. He did not demand things his way. He may have even wanted it the way that he states, but he didn't demand it. And if it went otherwise, he was willing to accept it. As he says here in Matthew 26 and verse 39, and it's just before the crucifixion. And he went a little farther, and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. In other words, if it's possible, I don't want to face this crucifixion. That was his personal will. He didn't really want to face it. He didn't want to have to go through it. But he said, nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. In other words, God, you're the one that's in charge. And I'm not demanding that it go my way. I'm letting you decide, and let you decide which way it should go. I'm just suggesting that if it is possible, let's do it some other way. If it's not possible, okay, we'll do it this way, the way you said. Tremendous attitude of not self-will, not demanding his way. We need to be careful that we're not self-willed. I think sometimes in a family argument, the problem is that the husband and the wives are self-willed. That they are demanding it their way, when literally it would work either way. You know, maybe it's like, what restaurant are you going to if you're going out to dinner? What difference does it make whether you're eating Mexican food or the garbage food? You know, it doesn't make any difference. Or maybe it's a decision on, you know, what type of refrigerator you're going to get. Usually a husband doesn't get that set on, or something that you're going to buy. And usually, it could go either way. But if both take their stance self-will, it's going to be my way, it's going to be a Ford or else, if it's a car. It's going to be a Ford or no car. Well, that's ridiculous. Because there are a few other cars that manage to get up and down the road other than Ford. There really are. At least one or two. But you see, if a person is self-willed and demanding their way, and that they're right and that's the only way it'll go, you know, it's funny. If it doesn't go that way, life goes on, doesn't it? It's funny. You don't have to have your way. Hey, the same yesterday, today, and forever. And I think about the characteristics that Christ had, that I'm not envious of them. I just want to strive, and I hope in my own personal life, to develop these characteristics so I'm a little closer to building the mind and the character of Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul, over in Philippians 4, tells us a bit about this. And the Apostle Paul came very close in building these characteristics, probably not perfectly. But he shows us how to build these characteristics here in Philippians, the 4th chapter, beginning in verse 4. This is how you build that characteristic, or the characteristics that I've been talking about here, and the characteristics in the mind of Christ. Verse 4, he says, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. How many of you are happy that you're a part of God's church and a part of God's work? How many of us rejoice all the time? How many of us can say we're always glad to be a part of God's church? If there's one bright spot in our life, it's God and God's work and God's church. Now, the rest of it may be pretty gloomy and dull. But if there's one bright spot, that is it. If there's one good decision I ever made, this is it. And to always have that attitude. To rejoice in it, even during the time of trouble or difficulty. That's not an easy thing to do. He says, let your moderation, or your yieldness, as it could be translated, and should, let your yieldness be known unto all men, the Lord is at hand. In other words, don't be ashamed of it. Be proud of the fact that you're yielding to God and to God's way of life. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. You begin to approach God and God's Word that way, and your yieldness to God, and the peace of God which passes all understanding will keep your hearts and minds through Christ. He says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. I got some mail through the mail, or Marilyn and I did, here last week. It's called the famous Ambassador Report. First copy we've ever been sent. I don't know how we got it, but we got it, and I think most of the ministers in the area got it. And I took a look at it, and I just couldn't stand to read it. Because it was nothing but garbage. It was negative. From word 1 through about 8 or 10 pages, it was negative. They had negative, 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 negative. Everything was against, everything was horrible, everything was bad, everything was terrible. The church was falling apart. It was all about the worldwide Church of God, of course. And you don't realize how horrible you people are. You don't realize what a mess this congregation is in Portland South. Now, I knew it, but then, no, I hadn't either. But everything was negative. Everything was against. Everything was bad. That's terrible. Because everything isn't bad. Because I take a look at the Portland area. I take a look at the Portland South Church. It's not all bad. Just parts. Not all. No, it's not that way. It's as though the way of life that is portrayed by God's church is so terrible that anybody could even remotely think of having anything to do with it must be crazy. And that's the way he looked at it. Now, we should believe in the immortality of the soul. We should believe that we're not born into the God family and carry the God name. Now, they pointed those two things out, but, I kind of shake my head a little bit. Where are these guys? They were supposed to have been members of God's church at one time. But it was all negative. And you start dwelling on the negative, and everything's bad, and everything's wrong, and everything is terrible. Why, everything looks that way. Well, not that way. Christ didn't look at it that way. He didn't call you into his church and say, you're a dirty, rotten, filthy stinker, and I don't want to have anything to do, and my dad says I have to. So therefore I'll do it if I have to. But look at you. Look at all you do. Boy, I wish I could get rid of you. No, that's the way he looks at it. No, he doesn't look at the church that way. Well, we're not supposed to look at things that way. In other words, it's a positive attitude instead of a negative attitude. Sure, we all commit sins. Sure, we all do things that we shouldn't do. That isn't all we do. Occasionally we do it right. Really, we do, honestly. We do it right once in a while. Why not emphasize the positive and eliminate the negative? There's a song on that. That's old fogies. But at any rate, there was a song on that. And that's what Paul's saying. He said, look, serve God, be happy about it, and look at the things that are right and proper and true, and think about those things. Don't dwell on a rotten, filthy world that is run by Satan the devil. Now, true enough, he's all negative. But don't think on those things. Don't be that way. Don't be that way. Those things which you have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. Do the things that God says, and the God of peace shall be with you. But I rejoiced in the Lord greatly, that now at the last your care of me has flourished again, wherein you were also careful, but you lacked opportunity. In other words, he was about to die, and he knew it. He knew he was about to die, and he rejoiced in God greatly, even though he knew he was going to be martyred. He says, one thing he learned, in verse 11, and brethren, here's one thing we need to learn in order to be the same yesterday, today, and forever. Not that I speak of respect of one, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. You know, that's with the exception of Texas. He learned to be content. He learned to be content. Rejoiced in God always. He learned to rejoice in God always, to think on the positive things, and to be content in the situation that he found himself. He says, I both know how to be abased, I know how to abound, everywhere in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. And how did Paul do it? Very simply, I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. In other words, it's through Christ you can do it. It's through Christ that you can build these characteristics. And I'll leave you with this statement. Strive to be like Christ through